Hi, I'm Jeff Brindle, and this is the history of the Commission project, and have the pleasure of sitting down with Tom Byrne today. And before we start, I just want to go over a little bit about your background.
Sure.
For the people and who will be watching this. Former chairman of the Democratic State Committee from 1994 to 1997.
Right.
Has been involved with the State Investment Council, and that was from 2010 to 2018. And you were the chairman for a period of time there.
Yep.
Economic and Fiscal Policy Working Group.
Mm-hmm.
New Jersey Pension and Health Benefits Study Commission, very important
Yes.
commission, very important work that was done. Also a graduate of Princeton University and Fordham Law School.
Right.
And currently the director of the Byrne Asset Management Company.
Right.
Before we get started and we get going with the politics and the commission and so forth, is there anything you want to say about your background or to begin with?
Not really. I mean, I feel like I've been a hardworking person, but I feel like I've also been a pretty lucky person. And, look, I grew up in a household where public service was a part of a tradition and a belief it's something you should do if you can. Princeton University has a motto of Princeton in the Nation's Service, which was coined by Woodrow Wilson. And so I was kind of imbued with that at a young age. I also, like people, and I think I have a decent mind for policy. And as one friend told me, where other people just see black and white, you seem to find a gray area that works for people. And so I never wanted to rely on the political system to make a living, but I wanted to be involved. And so that's kind of been my life. I make my living in the private sector, but I've tried to be civically and politically involved when I can.
Great. You kind of touched upon something that I was going to mention later on in the interview, but you're the son of a former Governor Byrne.
Yep.
And growing up in that kind of household and so forth, and was that an incentive for you to get involved in? I asked this to Governor Whitman a couple of weeks ago when we interviewed her. And was that an incentive for you to get involved in politics?
Well, I'm sure it helped form who I am. But I remember a friend years ago saying to me, "Boy, I'm so jealous. I wish I could have sat at your dinner table and listened to the discussions." And say, "You really weren't missing anything." I mean, we didn't sit around the table talking about politics all the time. We were a pretty normal family. Mm-hmm. And I was 19 and already through 3 semesters of college when my father first got elected. And as you may remember, he was a fairly unlikely candidate in 1973, right. And for a variety of circumstances, a bunch of party leaders decided that he was just given Watergate and given other things that were going on. He was a candidate for the Times once the party leaders thought we could actually win this thing if we have the right guy in 1973. He once told me that 18 months before he was the nominee, you could have gotten 100 to 1 odds on him. So, it's just one of those things that happened, and I like to think was good for him, and more importantly, good for the state.
Did you ever get to participate in the tennis tournaments at Morven that your father used to hold?
Yeah, I don't know if I ever played in the tournaments, but I certainly played with certain guests who were there, and that was fun. My dad had Althea Gibson. Moore had a lot of other people came through, and not just tennis, but a lot of interesting people in general. So as a college sophomore, oh man, my parents moving in almost across the street, not so good. But it turned out they were busy. They weren't hiding behind trees on the Princeton campus wondering what I was up to. And when there was something interesting going on at Morven, I could go home. And I was very actively involved in both of his campaigns. Mm-hmm. I was a surrogate speaker, sat in on strategy sessions, and had a substantive role in both races.
Very good. Let's talk a little bit about your chairmanship of this Democratic State Committee.
Sure.
Can you talk about your experience and what was the process? You were very young at the time.
Yep.
To become chairman of that committee.
Yep.
What was the experience and how did you go about gaining the chairmanship?
I didn't do a whole lot, to tell you the truth. What happened was, if we rewind into history for a minute, Jim Florio loses the governorship to Christy Whitman. The world then is seen as Bob Torricelli versus Rob Andrews for governor. McGreevey wasn't yet a factor. Both of those guys kind of wanted their own person, if you will, to be party chairman. And so that went back and forth for a while. And finally, I was sort of everybody's second choice. And that happens in politics a lot.
Sure.
And so one of the great grand old men of New Jersey politics, a fellow named Tom Hartman, who was a professor at Rutgers who taught a lot of people in Trenton, apparently called John Lynch. I didn't know about this. Called John Lynch and said, I think I have an idea for you. And John liked it, and he apparently called Bob Torricelli, and Bob Torricelli, I'm told, said I should have thought of that. And then the other piece of this was somebody acceptable to the Andrews crew, and I had, I don't know, I guess lunch with George Norcross, and I think John Lynch was there, and Hartman that weekend. And they were for me, and we just had an hour-long discussion. I later said to George, why were you for me? You didn't know me from Adam. And he said, I saw you were a businessman, and I thought that's what the party needed. And he just shrugged his shoulders. And so that's sort of how it came about. So yeah, once that all started happening, I made phone calls to county leaders and to all the members of the state committee and so forth. But it was one of those circumstances that I had been municipal chairman in Princeton, Democratic municipal chairman, for probably 2 months. So I joked around that I was the only municipal chairman in the state that was undefeated, untied, and actually unvoted against. So
That doesn't happen too often.
no. So, and part of it too was they were just, okay, look, we need to settle this. We need a compromise candidate who's agreeable to all. It's a 2-year term, and if he's no good, we'll get somebody else in 2 years. And at the end of 2 years, they decided I was pretty good, so I served another term.
So John Lynch was the majority, the
Senate leader, yes.
Senate leader at that
Democratic
time,
leader, right.
and he was instrumental
Yes,
in that process.
yes.
One of the things I wanted to ask you, you did make a proposal at that time in terms of uniting the party, and as I understand it, the proposal was that if 65% of the county chairpersons were to support a candidate for governor, that then you would try to get consensus of all the other chairpersons to support that person.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that a little
Sure.
bit?
Part of that was there was an article in one of the newspapers, I don't remember which one, saying the Democratic Party was really becoming irrelevant in the state. It's hard to believe now, right? Because we've been a dominant party in New Jersey, but it was not clearly a blue state back then. One thing said we were so irrelevant that we were on the verge of becoming the third political party in New Jersey. So some of this was simply to get attention focused back on us and to have the party taken seriously. That's the main point. The threshold was also a number that was never going to happen. And it was set at a level where we knew it was never going to happen, but it got the party leaders around the table talking to each other, which I think made it easier to unify the party afterwards. And it also served the purpose of there were candidates claiming that they had that level of support. And this was a way of saying, since you really don't yet. And the primary bore that out. I don't think anybody got 50%, much less 65. And so, and if a message went back to the other candidates that there was this thing, it would have made them think. But frankly, it was never going to happen. But I think it focused more attention on the importance of political parties, and that was the essential goal, to have people take us seriously.
Yeah, very,
And they did.
very important to focus. As you probably know, we've been trying to, here at the commission, to call for strengthening of political parties, which they've been.
So that was about.
Weekend. Yeah.
And some people criticized it at the time as some backroom deal. I mean, it wasn't, but I understand why people said it. But as I say, I think we achieved the goal of making people take the party seriously.
Yeah, I think it was a good idea. It's a good idea. Yeah, in 1993, there were the Rosenthal reforms.
Sure.
And one aspect of the Rosenthal reforms was to strengthen the political parties.
Yeah.
And by allowing the parties to contribute as much as they could to their candidates, and also raising the contribution limits much higher than contribution limits for candidates themselves. So this really did have the effect of strengthening, particularly county parties, as we went forward, and during your term as state chairman. Did these reforms help you to raise money at the state level?
Ironically, probably not. And the reason is because the leadership PACs, when they came into existence, if you were somebody who wanted to influence the legislative process and you had a choice of giving money to me as state party chairman or giving money to John Lynch or the assembly leader or whomever, a lot of money flowed in that direction. And so the case I had to make, well, first of all, a lot of the way I raised money is I drove all over the state and saw people face to face. And one of the things that I did is I explained to people exactly how their money was being used by a state party. And I'm not sure a lot of people really understand what a state party does and how that money benefits things they care about. And so, the reforms, while they strengthened the parties in the aggregate, helped the leadership PACs much more than they helped the state party. And as I say, the state party benefited everybody from, in a presidential year, from the presidential race on down. And so I had to say to people, look, if you want a strong Democratic Party statewide, give the money to us. Leadership PACs don't really, maybe they do something, but not as much in local races and so forth. So I tried to make the case that we served everybody up and down the Democratic ticket.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned leadership PACs.
Yeah.
And they were actually formalized. They had existed kind of in the 1980s, but then they were formalized with these reforms.
And with a strengthened leader in the legislature. Right. I think that made a big difference.
Yeah, exactly. So the leadership PACs there are 4 leadership PACs, and
right.
the Senate President and the Senate Minority Leader and the Speaker of the Assembly and the Minority Leader in the Assembly all have their
sure.
leadership PACs, and there are certain rules that apply to them, and they raise money and they
right.
spend on their candidates, and
right.
so it did help the parties.
Absolutely.
as well.
Now, part of this, as you well know, is that Alan Rosenthal at Eagleton believed in a strong legislature.
That's right.
And without any constitutional changes of any sort, I think it did tip the balance. New Jersey constitutionally already has the strongest governor in the country. And I think back in my father's time and Governor Kane's time and so forth, the governor really ran the legislative agenda, and they had as much influence as the legislative leaders themselves. And I think
Absolutely.
Alan felt that was a little out of balance. And I would say if you have a benevolent governor, somebody who people respect and so forth, it's one thing. And so I think you could argue that case both ways, whether the legislative leaders should be this strong or not. I mean, they become their own show in some respect. But that was the effect of the change, I think, and the money that went into leadership PACs, I think, strengthened them. And what it did too is, it made it harder for individual legislators to go against leadership. I'm the leader and you want to dissent from a particular party position, you might pay the price in terms of campaign contributions from
More
leadership.
discipline.
Yeah, more discipline. And less freedom. And
right.
so you make your own judgment about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah. One of the things, we were talking about the political parties. Again, I'm talking with Tom Byrne, who is a former chairman of the Democratic State Committee. And we've here at ELEC, we've made several recommendations to strengthen political parties and
Mm-hmm.
to bring disclosure to these independent groups that have come on the scene
Right.
in recent years. And part of those recommendations, one is to increase contribution limits for the parties, to remove the parties from, we'll talk about pay to play a little bit in a little bit, but to remove the parties from pay to play, to allow county parties to give to each other, which was, and personally, I've called for a tax credit for political parties, and to include PACs under pay to play. Is that something you could support in terms of our recommendations to strengthen the political parties?
Yeah, by and large, I think so. I've always viewed pay to play as what you want to prevent is influence buying, particularly influence buying that can lead to contracts for public services, whether law or engineering or anything else. They're inflated. And I remember talking to a mayor in North Jersey who said to me, a lot of towns are paying 3 times what they should for certain services because, these contributors basically fund their election campaigns, and this is, the unspoken payback. Yeah. So that's what you don't want. And at the flip side of that, you don't want a situation where some fairly modest amount of money to a candidate that you believe in or you think is good is a bad thing. In my business, if I were to ever go after public money, I have to be very careful about what I give to people. And I do give money to candidates who I just think are good people. Mm-hmm. And I can remember a situation when I was chairman of the investment council that the wife of a private equity guy violated the pay-to-play rules by giving money to one of her girlfriends who was running for legislature in a district where she had no chance, and did it as a friend, and almost cost her husband's firm a huge amount of money inadvertently. And so I just think you want to simplify those rules and put limits at a reasonable level. And in antitrust law, they call it sort of a rule of reason. Mm-hmm. You want to prevent influence buying. You don't want to prevent good faith and good government type of contributions. That's how I see it.
Yeah, you have a good deal of familiarity with the legislative process, and and I do want to get into pay-to-play a little bit. Yeah. But sometimes there are unintended consequences of legislation. Sure. And one of the unintended consequences that we've seen of pay-to-play is that it was enacted in 2006, went into effect, and it did serve as a catalyst really for the growth of independent groups in New Jersey, and it did, by doing that, kind of weaken the political parties. Yeah. Why do you think it's important for lawmakers to consider unintended consequences when they're considering legislation?
Well, I mean, we could spend
and
an hour.
There's a lot of that.
We could spend an hour just on that. I talk about that a lot in terms of economic and fiscal policy and so forth. I just think that has to be part of any debate, and you just want to think it through before you rush something through, say at the end of a legislative session, which happens often enough. There clearly are, and as it applies to independent expenditures, you've heard it before that political contributions are like water. They'll find a way. Right. And I think the important thing is disclosure. Now, having said that, I don't see disclosure. A lot of people who are political reformers see disclosure as a panacea. I don't, and the reason I don't is because there are so many people who can't name their state legislators or the county commissioners or whatever. And so if they're not aware of that, are they really going to be aware of everybody who's contributing, even if it's disclosed on a website? So that's why I say it's not a panacea, but I do think it's an important thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you should say that because, I do teach at the College of New Jersey, and sometimes when we talk about political parties and elections and so forth, and the reason for political parties and how important they are as a cue to voting, and I'll ask the students, I'll say, well, do you know who your legislator is? Do you vote? First of all, I'll say, do you vote? And yeah, everybody says they vote. Right. And then I'll say, who's your legislator? Who's your mayor? And they don't know.
They don't know. Exactly.
And so you make a good point there in terms of that.
But at the same time, even if there's not a general awareness of this, if a situation arises that looks like influence buying or something like that, at least there's a paper trail, and that's good enough.
No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So that's why I say a step in the right direction. Yeah.
Public financing, and talking about your father when he was governor. Mm-hmm. He is the governor that was responsible for getting public financing passed and enacted, and the first public financing program took place in 1977 when your father was governor and he participated in the gubernatorial program. And of course, the program at that time only extended to the general election,
Right.
and until 1981 it was extended to the primaries.
Mm-hmm.
But also in 1981, your father also signed what was called the open primary
Yes.
law. And I think the term open primary, then correct me if you think I'm wrong, but the term open primary law for New Jersey was somewhat of a misnomer, because open primary really kind of means anybody can walk in on the day of primary and decide what party they're going to vote for on that particular day.
Right.
Whereas our open primary law really referred to restricting the ability of parties to endorse
Right.
candidates and to give them the line,
Right.
on the ballot. And at that time, the interesting thing in terms of your father signing, I believe it was signed during the primary election, or right before it.
Yeah.
And it did help Governor Kane, I think, to get the nomination to run for governor for the Republicans.
Interesting.
Because Pat Kramer was the mayor of Patterson, and he had most of the lines, or he had gotten the party support, and the open primary law then opened things up, and he couldn't take advantage of that. How important is the gubernatorial public financing program? And
Look, I think it's important because I think you want different voices, you thoughtful people to be heard, to at least have a platform. And I think that's what it does. It also, back to what we were saying, it's a hard case to make to the general public, but I think it limits influence buying. And in that sense, I think you can make a long, somewhat convoluted argument that it actually saves taxpayers money. Having said that, once again, I don't see it as a panacea. And what I mean by that is that at the time it was enacted, I don't think anybody could have foreseen the amount of personal money that certain candidates have spent. And so I think the value of it is at least it gets voices on the stage so that money, personal money in particular, doesn't snuff out other policy prescriptions or proposals and so forth. So in that sense, I think in both a primary and a general, it's a wise investment. Now, it has to be a limited investment, and I understand people in the general public saying, we're just paying for, why should we pay tax dollars for negative ads and so forth? And so, maybe there needs to be more careful thinking about exactly how it's applied, but on balance, I think it's a good investment in public policy.
That certainly was one of the among many achievements of that your father was able to accomplish during his governorship.
Yeah,
but
also I think Governor Whitman would tell you that it made a huge difference in her race when she first got elected. And again, aside from the merits, whether you voted for Jim Floyd or Christy Whitman, you had a choice where both sides got some oxygen, and you could make a more intelligent decision.
Yeah, right. And it's always been held up, New Jersey's public financing program, as a national model.
Right.
Because it eliminated any kind of undue influence from the process. We've never had any kind of corruption or anything, attached to gubernatorial elections.
That's right.
So it's been a grand success for New Jersey, and it's also allowed individuals of limited means, personal financial means, to run for governor who are qualified. So it's really been a big success. And
I agree completely, but I just reemphasize that when somebody comes in with a huge personal fortune and decides they're going to spend a good chunk of that, there's a little bit of a self-fulfilling aspect to it, number one. Number two, candidates who don't have that kind of wealth, what I know some consultants got paid in some of these situations, no ordinary candidate can match. Yeah. And so it can, the use of personal fortunes, while the Supreme Court says that's legal, I frankly think they misread the intent of the First Amendment and the founders when they ruled that way. I mean, I think the reason we have a First Amendment is so political speech can be out there, not so some forms of political speech are squelched. And so I think the Supreme Court kind of confused content and volume, if you will.
Right, I mean, and the First Amendment really does apply to political speech.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
You know, getting back to the open primary law, and that was in effect for about 8 years, I guess, until 1989. There was a Supreme Court decision, the EU decision.
Yes, spelled EU.
EU, right, EU decision, and that had to do with the San Francisco Democratic Central
Right.
Committee, and basically what the EU decision did, it found the open primary law to be unconstitutional as applied to California.
Yeah.
And allowed endorsements of the party, allowed support by the party for a candidate for governor, and also to provide the line in the primary. And that decision then made New Jersey's open primary law unconstitutional. Is there anything you want to speak about that?
I wonder if that decision has been a little bit misread. Because the facts in that case in California were that a party couldn't even endorse. So, okay, fine, now a party can endorse, a party can give money to a favored candidate,
Right.
and a party can award the line, but I would argue that we've gone a step further and almost hidden the other candidates on the ballot. And I don't think the U case says that a party has a right to go and hide the other candidates. And so I think that it's not an open primary in the sense that there's still a line, but if we said, the party doesn't automatically get line A or whatever, I think that would probably withstand a challenge under the U doctrine.
Yeah, so what you're talking about is a lot of the candidates that are not party candidates are way down ballot.
Yeah, it's really hard to find them.
Yeah.
And I don't think the U case in any manner said that's a great thing.
That's an interesting, I haven't heard that take on that, but that's an interesting way to think about it.
That'll get litigated at some point.
Yeah, well, I think there is litigation
Yeah.
in taking place right now.
Yeah.
With regard to that kind of issue.
Right, I haven't read those briefs,
Right.
needless to say, but
Right.
that's an argument that I would make if I were on that side of the case.
Now, you yourself, had considered entering as a candidate in
Yes.
a number of, possibly for Congress or for Senate and
Yeah,
governor, I
2 times.
guess, at one.
Yeah, well, I
at
thought
one
about running
point.
for governor this last
Right.
time.
Right.
And that was one of the situations where, as I say, if I paid the consultants what they were being paid, I would run up against the spending limit before I did anything else. And so, I actually, I can name names, but had people come to me later and say, sorry. That sort of thing, but I understand it. I mean, political consulting is, let's call it a seasonal business, and I can't say I blame people for taking the money. And at the same time, when you want to talk about a level playing field, very, very hard for another candidate to fight that kind of money. Not impossible, but in my case, when this whole thing was starting, it looked like there might be 5 candidates in the Democratic field. Yeah. And I thought, sort of like my father, he did not have a majority. He had a plurality in the 1977 primary. And I thought I was prepared to run as the most fiscally responsible Democrat. And I thought maybe I could carve out a third of the vote, and in a crowded field I could win. But the way it played out when Murphy and Fulop had breakfast and Fulop's out of the race overnight, all of a sudden, very, very quickly, North Jersey just kind of coalesced around Murphy. And, I just thought, I could fight money, I could fight the county lines, but I'm not sure I can fight all of that.
You know what was very interesting about the 1977 campaign?
Yeah.
When your father ran for re-election, was that because he had the courage to sign an income tax, to establish the first state income tax, he became very unpopular for a while. And I think there were about 11 candidates that ran
That was the strategy.
against him in the 1977
Right.
primary.
Right.
And as I recall, your father got about 30% of the
That's right.
vote.
That's
but
right.
Yet,
Plurality, no runoff.
but yet won
Yeah.
because
if
there
we
were
had
so many
if this
candidates.
were a runoff state, I doubt he would have won.
Yeah.
But I remember being at a meeting, and it was probably early January of '77, and I was kind of just a fly on the wall, but I was there, and basically everybody in the meeting said, "Look, history will treat you kindly, but you're at 16% favorable in the polls. There's absolutely no chance you can win a general election, and you owe it to the party to bow out gracefully." And really, John Degnan was the only person in the room who said, "You have every right to run on your record." In the car on the way home, he asked me what I thought, and I said, "Look, what we were alluding to before, people don't know outside their home county who these candidates." I said, every major county is going to have their own horse in the race. Nobody outside the home county is going to have heard of any of these guys. You're the issue. It's going to break down as a pro-Byrne, anti-Byrne vote. And as long as you whack up the antis in enough different ways, you win. And I said, and then in a general election, you were a great prosecutor. You're nothing if not a great debater. And once the issues are joined, anything can happen in the general election. And that's what happened.
And it did, because
Yes.
your father won by a landslide victory. He ran against the Senate president at that time, Ray Bateman.
Yeah,
And,
I think I won the pool, the informal pool in campaign headquarters, because people, even as we were coming down the wire, thought maybe 51, 52%. But it was a pretty substantial victory.
No, it was a very substantial
Yes, yeah.
victory.
And as I say, once the issues are joined and people are paying attention, they were like, okay, we may not love this, but it's better than the alternatives we see out there.
No, and I think people got used to the income tax by that time.
Yes.
I mean, at first it was a major shock to people and,
Yes.
reaction, but, that's not too bad.
No, and the rates are obviously much lower, and it was done really just to fund urban education, places where the tax base simply didn't support public schools. And a Democratic governor and a Republican governor before my father tried to enact it and were not able to. And key Republican leaders in the legislature helped get it passed. Everybody knew it had to be done. Now, the next question is, does it have to be at the rates they are today? And the income tax, I think, today does a lot more than fund urban education. It funds a lot of other stuff in government, and you can ask, was this really the purpose of the income tax?
I should have actually mentioned that when we started talking about that the reason that the income tax was enacted was because of the Abbott decision.
Absolutely.
Education.
Absolutely.
And it was the first. Prior to that, there was never any kind of income tax in New Jersey, and so forth. So that was a major. Very courageous decision that had to be made to push that.
And constitutionally, it still has to be spent on education, but I think that definition has been stretched in some ways.
Right, exactly. Getting a little bit more back to what we do here and some of the concerns that we have. One of them, of course, is the proliferation of independent groups and the tremendous spending that has taken place in New Jersey elections. Millions of dollars, actually, since over the last 2 decades or so, these groups have really, as we mentioned, following the pay-to-play reforms, where these groups came into, and they've been spending millions of dollars on not only state legislative elections and gubernatorial elections, but also local elections as well. And of course, we've called for disclosure. Of those groups. How important do you think disclosure of these groups would be to the electoral process?
Same thing. I think transparency and openness and disclosure are important in an election. I don't know the numbers here, and I really have this secondhand, so I should be a little careful, I suppose, but I understand that the NRA put a lot of money into the race that Jim Florio lost in 1993. If there were more disclosure around that, it might have made a difference. And so this is one of any number of examples where, yes, I believe disclosure is important. I'm not an expert on how that falls constitutionally, but I absolutely think it's the right thing to do. And I also think that if I want to help you, if you're a candidate, I want to help you, and I have a choice between having my name, direct contribution disclosed, and maybe for whatever reason I don't want that, you give it indirectly. I mean, it creates an incentive to have more darkness, less light around the political process, and I don't think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, we feel that, if the legislation is narrowly tailored to just apply to electioneering activity, that it would be constitutional. But unfortunately, very often that's not the case with legislation.
That's right.
And it gets into problems. But yeah, I mean, we've seen it. We've tracked this for a number of years now. We've just seen a constant increase in independent spending and a weakening of the political parties.
So conceptually, I absolutely agree with you. Could I give you a detailed proposal off the top of my head on how to tailor it so that it would survive constitutional scrutiny? No, I'd have to put a lot more thought into it.
Well, we may ask you.
Good. Remember, I'm 25 years out of date on all this stuff. I was chairman from
well,
94
I'm sure you'd
97.
get caught up pretty quickly. But that is a very important issue in New Jersey, and I think the outside influence of these groups has really created a problem for the public because, like you had mentioned, the NRA in 1993, I think it was 1993, right?
Yes.
With Florio and of course, there have been other groups, and we have no idea. It could be a billionaire that's
right.
totally supportive.
And we should know and then make our own judgments,
right.
Whether we care or we don't care, but we should know.
Right. And you mentioned 1993, and of course this is in connection with political parties as well. When the 1993 gubernatorial election, Whitman and Florio, 63% of the people voted in that election. That's just 1993. And now, in recent elections, in some cases, all the way down to 21% in some assembly elections and so forth. I've always maintained that political parties are very important for getting out the vote.
Yes, I agree.
And may have contributed to this lessening of people turning out to vote. You have any thoughts on?
Yeah, look, I like the idea of people having some idea what they're voting on. So the first thing is having people be informed. I may be a minority here, but I'm sometimes bothered by the fact that my vote counts as the same as somebody who has no idea what they're voting on. Yeah. But you want to inform people, and you want broad participation in a democracy, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And a party has a role in both of those things. Consultants refer to the air war, which is TV ads and so forth, and the parties do a lot of the so-called ground war, which is knocking on doors, leafleting, and get out the vote activity, which is more than just election day, by the way. Get out the vote is starting to build enthusiasm and starting to explain to people why they should vote. One of the things that I used to do a lot when I talked to student groups is I would have examples, long lost to memory, of your vote does count. Here are elections that were decided by one vote or very few votes, and so your vote matters. May not matter in every election, but votes also matter even if they don't decide an election. If a candidate wins by a lot, there's more of a mandate. And so if you believe in a particular candidate's thinking, well, he's going to win or he's going to lose anyway, get out there and do it. And, in this last election, the last gubernatorial election between Murphy and Jack Ciattarelli, I think turnout mattered a lot. And turnout really can decide elections. And parties absolutely have a critical role in getting that to happen. But as I say, part of it is, and it's hard to do, particularly in a state like this where the media markets are so expensive, you want to do everything you can to get issues out there so people really explain them. And what we were talking about a minute ago on the income tax. The initial reaction is, another tax, this is terrible. But when people started to understand why it was done, and how it would help offset property taxes, at least in the short term, and that we had an obligation to give every kid in the state a shot at a decent education. People started to go, okay, didn't love this, but I understand why it was done and it was responsible, I'm going to vote for him.
And that's one of the issues today. So many people are getting their information from social media, and very often from people that don't know what they're talking about.
Or from not people at all,
right,
from bots.
Right. Yeah, right, from bots. Yeah, exactly. So, that's an issue too.
It's going to be a bigger and bigger issue.
Yeah.
But, everybody's concerned about global warming. But here's a situation where James Baker, George Shultz, some others who could walk into the Oval Office without knocking, proposed a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Can't get an audience. And it's an issue where if people understood it more, they might say, all right, we have to do something, and this may be a responsible way to go. Whatever the issue is, having better information for people I think makes a lot of sense.
Oh, yeah. No,
and frankly, I've talked about this, is a separate point, but I've talked about, can some of the nonprofits in the state host dinners, and I don't know what legal issues there are there, where you bring in experts to talk about certain policy issues and get into more depth than is often done even in the legislative process. When I was chairman, I used to sit in on the caucuses, and some of the discussion was substantive. Some of it was just plain politics. How's this going to help or hurt us? Yeah. And more in-depth education of, for instance, on the pension issue, which as chairman of the investment side of it, and also part of this commission that tried to prevent the whole pension system from going bankrupt in a decade from now. I was willing to sit down with any legislator who wanted to talk about it and get into the actuarial assumptions, and it's okay now, and it has $90 billion now, but 10 or 11 billion is going out the door every year, and the actuary says isn't going to last forever. To have people have a deeper understanding of that, I think can make a difference, better public policy, and frankly, something in the long-term interest of state employees who, may not understand how insecure their pensions really are.
Part of that would be, having people sit down from both parties and talking with each other, and that seems to be, with the polarization of politics these days, that seems to be a real issue to be able to accomplish that.
Well, at the national level, I had lunch with Governor Kane about a few months ago, and he said that when his father was in Congress, they stayed in Washington on weekends. They weren't expected back in their district all the time. So if kids played together, you got to know people on the other side, and they weren't running out to pack fundraisers all the time and so forth. At the state level, a little bit of the same thing, but they come and go from Trenton. And back when Trenton had a hotel, I would propose that maybe you put at least some of the legislative sessions back to back. Put them on Tuesday and Wednesday or something like that. So people sleep here, go out to dinner, and get to know each other. And I've also argued that back in the old days, legislators would go out to dinner at the Long Don Lorenzo's, and the tabloids would say $2,000 tab, but if during that dinner they agreed on something that saved the state taxpayers, $100 million or something like that, well, an engine needs some lubrication, and whatever it is, we have to find ways to get people talking, to get to know each other as friends. And as I said at the outset, I always thought I had an ability to kind of see a middle ground, we need more of that. I mean, this is completely off the subject, so I'll keep it to 30 seconds. But I remember after the stock market crash of 1987, I served on the staff of the Brady Commission. And I was at a meeting in the board of the New York Stock Exchange where the guys from the Chicago's futures market said, if the market goes down by way too much, we just shut it for the day and take the rest of the day off, and that works. And the guys from New York said, we shut the market a little bit during World War I, and that was a terrible thing. We'll never shut the market again. And I'm a kid in the room, and finally, after 15 minutes, I basically proposed what became the circuit breakers, and which was a gray area. And everyone went, that's interesting, maybe that'll work. And there are a lot of places in public policy where you could have gray area if we could get people talking and hopefully talking as friends.
Yeah, no, I mean, what you're saying is right on target. I first came down here as a legislative aide, and I remember those days where you would go over to Chambersburg, after a session, and Democrats, Republicans would all have dinner together, and they'd sit and they became friends.
Yes.
Yeah, there was a lot. They said their mind in the sessions and so forth, and they disagreed, but it wasn't the same kind of situation that we have today.
It wasn't the personal animosity. They kept it. They kept it at a professional level.
Right.
And look, when I was party chairman, I was outspoken on certain things that Governor Whitman did, probably most notably the pension bonds, which I thought then, think now, were a bad idea. But I remember toward the end of my time, they called me in and said, we appreciate that you never made it personal. And Christy Whitman and I today have a very nice relationship. As is well known in the state, my father and Governor Kane had a very strong friendship. And the state benefits from that. I have a lot of friends on both sides of the aisle in the legislature, and think maybe I could have done some good using all that. But that's what we need more of, not people demonizing each other, for heaven's sake. That doesn't help anybody. It really doesn't help you in your election campaign, and it just doesn't help the process function as it should for the benefit of the public. And so we need to find a way to encourage that. And as I say, I've explored with leaders of certain foundations in the state, is there a way for the foundations to play a role so that you don't have the tabloids saying we wasted public money? Can foundations somehow subsidize some of this under the rubric of public policy education?
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. Again, I'm talking with Tom Byrne, former chairman of the Democratic State Committee. And we're just about to conclude this conversation. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to the important things that you said today?
Not that I can think of. I think we've covered a lot of ground. What matters to me is as I've said, just you want an educated public, which is a challenge in this state because of the media markets. And you guys are doing what you can to encourage fair, open, well-disclosed elections, and that's a good thing for the state.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean that, again, just to end with, you make a very good point. In terms of the New York media market and the Philadelphia media market, they never covered New Jersey. They still don't.
They don't.
Even though
no, and we've made certain people have offices in Secaucus or wherever as a condition of licensing. We say you got to cover New Jersey, and when it's time to renew their license, say, oh yeah, we promise, and then they don't.
Yeah, right. Well, again, I want to thank you very much for coming in. It's been, I think, it's going to be very enlightening. For the public
I hope so.
To view, and what we're trying to do here is to create an archival of these interviews, and so that people in the future can kind of see what went on at our time and previous as well.
Absolutely, and what we learned from it, and what can we do better, and what's worked well, and so forth. I think it's a great thing.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much.
Good.
Great. Appreciate it.
Absolutely, great to be here.